Let me tell you something strange about silence in the digital age. We live in a world where almost everything is shared. Birthdays, coffee cups, sunsets, tears, laughter, even pain dressed up with filters. Yet, some people stay completely invisible. They scroll quietly, observe deeply, but rarely, if ever, post. You might even know someone like that. Maybe you are someone like that. And here's the question that always lingers in people's minds. Why? Why would someone choose to stay unseen when the whole world seems to be shouting for attention? It's easy to assume that people who don't post are simply shy or introverted, but that's not the full picture. Beneath the surface, there's an entire psychology at play, one that speaks volumes about human nature, self-perception, and the quiet rebellion against a culture obsessed with visibility. See, for some people, silence is not emptiness, it's control. It's the power to choose what the world doesn't get to know. Because whether we admit it or not, social media has subtly reshaped how we define ourselves. It rewards display, it praises noise, and yet those who stay in the shadows are often the ones who see everything most clearly. They watch without needing to interrupt. They think before reacting. They analyze before judging. Psychologists have found something fascinating. People who refrain from posting frequently often score higher on traits like self-restraint, introspection, and emotional independence. They tend to be less influenced by social comparison and external validation. In other words, they aren't trying to prove who they are. They're trying to understand it. And in a world drowning in performances, that's rare. Because let's be honest, most of what we post is not just communication, it's identity crafting. It's an unconscious audition for belonging. Every caption, every photo, every status update says, "This is who I am. Do you approve?" But when you stop posting, something shifts. You begin to detach your worth from digital applause. You stop thinking in captions. You start experiencing moments for yourself again, instead of for a lens. And that's the secret psychology behind many people who don't post. They crave authenticity in a space where everything feels staged. They don't hate social media. They just can't find themselves in it anymore. It's not about being anti-technology or anti-social. It's about refusing to reduce your life into highlights. Because when you've seen how easy it is to manipulate perception, you start valuing what can't be posted. Silence, depth, imperfection, truth. For some, the decision not to post comes after a kind of emotional burnout. Maybe they once did share everything, until one day it stopped feeling real. They realized that every time they shared something beautiful, they felt an invisible pressure to keep outdoing it. They weren't living anymore, they were performing. So they quit, quietly, no announcement, just a slow disappearance from the feed. But here's what's often misunderstood. Not posting doesn't mean not feeling. It doesn't mean they don't care. It often means they care too much. About presence, about meaning, about protecting what's sacred. There's a concept in psychology called psychological ownership. It's the feeling that something belongs deeply to you. A thought, a memory, an experience. And when you post it, that sense of ownership fades just a little. The moment becomes shared property, open to judgment, misinterpretation, even mockery. So people who don't post are often guarding their sense of ownership over life itself. They keep their moments untouchable, private, pure. And maybe that's not sadness or withdrawal. Maybe it's a quiet kind of freedom. Because think about it. When was the last time you did something meaningful and didn't feel the urge to share it? When was the last time you laughed, cried, or achieved something and didn't immediately think of posting it online? That reflex, that need to display, is not natural, it's conditioned. It's the product of a decade of likes, shares, and dopamine loops training our brains to equate validation with value. And when someone steps outside that system, it can feel like rebellion. But it's also healing. They start rediscovering the simplicity of doing things for themselves again. Cooking without photographing it, traveling without tagging it, feeling without explaining it. In that space, something awakens. A kind of self-awareness that doesn't need an audience. But not everyone who doesn't post is doing it from a place of peace. Some are driven by fear, the fear of judgment, rejection, or being misunderstood. Social media has amplified a subtle form of anxiety psychologists call self-presentational pressure. It's the constant awareness that you're being watched, even when you're not. And for many, that's exhausting. They worry that what they say might be misread, or worse, ignored. So they retreat, not because they don't want to connect, but because the cost of visibility feels too high. They want to be seen, but only truly, not superficially. And ironically, sometimes the quietest people online have the loudest thoughts in their minds. They're not absent, they're overflowing. They just choose stillness instead of spectacle. There's a deep philosophical undertone to that silence. In a world that constantly says, "Look at me," choosing invisibility becomes a form of self-definition. It's saying, "I exist beyond your perception." They might scroll through others' lives, nodding, smiling, sometimes aching, but they rarely project, because they understand something most don't. Not everything you experience is meant to be witnessed. Sometimes the most profound things in life, growth, grief, transformation, happen quietly, unseen, unposted. And when you've lived through enough of those private transformations, you start realizing that being unseen is not the same as being insignificant. It's actually where identity is formed, not performed. This is where the paradox lies. Social media was designed to connect us, yet it often leaves people feeling more isolated than ever. When you don't post, you stop chasing digital closeness and start rebuilding real ones. You begin noticing who checks in on you without the need for updates. You learn who remembers you without reminders. That kind of connection, raw, unbroadcasted, feels heavier, warmer, and infinitely more real. And the people who don't post, they live in that space. They build relationships that don't need proof. They find comfort in the unshared moment, and they let life unfold without turning it into content. Part of this is also about identity security, knowing who you are even when nobody's watching. When you're comfortable in your own company, you don't need an audience to validate your worth. That's not arrogance, it's peace. And ironically, the same people who don't post often have the most interesting stories to tell, but they save them for when you're sitting across the table, not across the screen. Because real connection to them isn't measured in comments or likes. It's in shared silence, in eyes meeting, in laughter that doesn't need witnesses. These are the people who carry worlds within them, who process deeply, observe constantly, and understand quietly. They don't need the world to applaud their existence. They just need to live it. And maybe, just maybe, in a world so desperate to be seen, their silence isn't a flaw. It's a mirror, a reminder that not everything meaningful has to be shared, that sometimes the most human thing you can do is to keep something entirely for yourself. You know what's fascinating? The longer someone stays off social media, the more they begin to see the world differently. Colors look richer, time feels slower, conversations feel fuller. It's as if stepping away from the noise makes everything real again. Because when you stop performing, you start experiencing. There's a quiet beauty in walking through life without needing proof of every step. You're not thinking about angles or lighting or captions. You're just there, fully alive, inside the moment instead of outside it. And that's something social media rarely lets us do anymore. But the psychology behind this goes deeper than preference or taste. It's rooted in how our brains process validation. Every time we post something online and it gets attention, likes, comments, hearts, our brain releases dopamine, the same chemical involved in reward and addiction. Over time, we begin to crave that validation. We start thinking in terms of shareable experiences instead of real ones. Now imagine someone who resists that loop. Someone who deliberately chooses to disconnect from the dopamine cycle. That's not disinterest, that's discipline. It takes self-awareness to resist something designed to keep you hooked. People who don't post often have a strong internal locus of control, a psychological term meaning their sense of worth and happiness comes from within, not from external approval. They don't need the digital echo of "you're enough" to believe it. And here's what's even more interesting. Studies show that people who take long breaks from posting or consuming social media content often experience a measurable increase in emotional stability and life satisfaction. Because when your sense of identity is no longer being constantly mirrored back to you, it becomes solid, it becomes real. You're no longer editing your life into something digestible. You're living it in all its messy, beautiful, unfiltered complexity. And maybe that's the real rebellion, to stay whole in a world that rewards fragments. But silence online doesn't always mean serenity. Sometimes it hides exhaustion. For many, social media became a place where they once sought connection, but ended up feeling drained. There's a subtle emotional fatigue that comes from witnessing everyone's highlight reels, while you're still trying to piece together your own behind the scenes. You start comparing, even when you don't mean to. You start questioning your worth, even when you know better. And eventually, some people decide to step away, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. They realize they don't owe the world a performance. They don't owe an explanation for their silence. And they don't need to keep proving they're happy just to be believed. That's one of the quiet truths of this generation. We've confused visibility with value. We assume that to matter, we must be noticed. But real meaning doesn't need witnesses. Some of the most meaningful moments of your life, the ones that shape who you are, will happen without a single person watching. No cameras, no captions, no audience, just you. And maybe that's what those who don't post understand best. They know that privacy is not loneliness, it's intimacy with yourself. Because when you stop broadcasting every thought, you start hearing your own again. You start reconnecting with the parts of you that got lost in the noise, your quiet desires, your unspoken fears, your inner compass. And that's something profoundly spiritual in today's world. It's not a withdrawal, it's a homecoming. Of course, it's not always peaceful. There are moments of doubt, of wondering if silence makes you invisible, if you're falling behind while everyone else is performing progress. But with time, you start noticing something beautiful. Your worth doesn't disappear when nobody's looking. It's still there, steady, like the hum of a quiet room after a storm. And maybe that's what real confidence looks like. Not the loud declaration of self online, but the calm assurance of self offline. Some people say, if you didn't post it, did it even happen? But the truth is, things that shape you most rarely make it to the feed. Your growth, your heartbreaks, your private victories, your quiet acts of kindness, they live in memory, not media. And maybe that's enough. When psychologists talk about authentic self-expression, they emphasize congruence, the alignment between who you are inside and who you show to the world. But in the age of filters, that alignment is constantly distorted. You begin to live as a version of yourself, curated for approval. So when someone chooses not to post, it might be their way of staying congruent, of preserving that fragile truth between their inner and outer world. They don't need everyone to see what they're feeling to validate that it's real. They don't need to capture every sunset to remember how it felt. They live their life fully and quietly. And here's the paradox. Those who live quietly often feel life most intensely. They're not distracted by the performance of it. They absorb details others miss. The way light changes on a wall, the pause before someone speaks, the sound of distant laughter. They are present, and presence is the rarest currency in a world built on attention. But sometimes that very presence makes them misunderstood. People might label them as detached, mysterious, even cold. Yet if you look closer, their silence isn't emptiness, it's depth. It's the calm that comes from no longer needing to explain yourself to be understood. There's a quiet confidence that comes from not needing to be known by everyone, just understood by a few. And that's what the people who don't post understand best. They know that not every truth is meant for the crowd, that some parts of you deserve to remain untouched by algorithms and opinions. Because once something becomes public, it stops being purely yours. It belongs to interpretation, to judgment, to trend. And maybe some moments are too sacred for that. So the next time you notice someone who never posts, don't assume they're hiding. Maybe they're just living. Maybe they've found peace in the quiet corners of existence, the ones not lit by the blue glow of a screen. Maybe they're the ones who've remembered what the rest of us forgot. That being unseen doesn't mean being alone. That being quiet doesn't mean being empty. That sometimes the truest expression of who you are is silence. Because in the end, we're not meant to be performances. We're meant to be people. And the people who don't post, they remind us of that every quiet, unfiltered, beautifully invisible day. Have you ever noticed that some of the kindest people you've ever met are also some of the most tired people? The ones who always show up, who always smile, who always say yes when you ask for help. But if you look closely enough, if you really pay attention, you can see the exhaustion in their eyes. You can sense that somewhere behind that kindness is something deeper, something heavier, maybe even something darker. We often imagine kindness as this pure, uncomplicated good. We tell children to be kind. We admire kindness in leaders. We measure our own humanity by how much compassion we can extend. But kindness, like everything else in this complicated world, has a shadow. And when you ignore that shadow, when you pretend it doesn't exist, kindness itself can turn into something destructive. It starts small. A child learns that being kind, being agreeable, earns them love. When they put their own needs aside to make others comfortable, they are rewarded with smiles, praise, maybe even affection they didn't receive otherwise. Over time, this association buries itself deep inside their nervous system. Kindness becomes survival, and the older they get, the harder it becomes to separate who they are from what others expect them to be. They become the reliable one, the good person, the friend who never complains. But here's the truth. When kindness is forced, when it is driven by fear of rejection or a desperate need to be valued, it's no longer pure kindness. It becomes a mask. And masks, when worn too long, start to suffocate the person beneath them. Think about the people in your life who are endlessly kind. They'll listen to your problems for hours. They'll help you move. They'll lend money they don't have. They'll sacrifice their own rest just to make sure you're okay. At first, it feels admirable, even saintly. But if you've ever been that person, if you've lived that role, you know the truth. Behind every act of self-sacrifice is a quiet resentment, a voice that whispers, "What about me?" But that voice is often silenced, because kindness, especially chronic kindness, comes with an unspoken rule. You're not allowed to put yourself first. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon, and it has a name: compassion fatigue. It describes what happens when someone gives so much of their empathy, so much of their care, that they eventually run dry. Healthcare workers experience it, teachers experience it, even parents experience it. But it's not only about professions. Everyday people, those who identify as kind souls, are at risk too. Studies show that people who consistently prioritize others over themselves report higher levels of anxiety, depression, and even physical health problems compared to those who maintain balance. Kindness, when unchecked, becomes self-erasure. And that's the dark side. Kindness without boundaries is not kindness at all. It becomes a subtle form of self-destruction. It's like watering every plant in the garden except your own roots. Eventually, the gardener collapses, and the entire garden withers with them. But here's the more unsettling part. Sometimes kindness itself becomes a weapon. And I don't mean in the obvious way, like someone pretending to be nice to manipulate others. I mean the quieter, more unconscious way. When you are known as the kind one, people start to expect it. They rely on it. They shape their behavior around it. And without even realizing it, your kindness teaches others that your needs are secondary, that your feelings are negotiable. Over time, people stop even asking what you want, because they assume you'll always adjust to them. The kind person ends up training the world to overlook them. This creates a paradox. The kinder you are, the more invisible you become. And invisibility is not peace. It's loneliness dressed up in politeness. Now, none of this means that kindness is bad. Far from it. Genuine kindness is one of the most beautiful forces in the world. But there's a difference between kindness that flows from abundance and kindness that bleeds from emptiness. One heals, the other corrodes. One comes from love, the other from fear. Let's look at some facts. In a study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, researchers found that people who struggle to say no, often those who identify as kind and agreeable, are significantly more likely to experience burnout. Another study out of the University of Berkeley showed that altruistic behavior increases well-being, but only when it is voluntary and authentic. When kindness is performed out of guilt, obligation, or fear of disappointing others, it has the opposite effect, actually lowering happiness and increasing stress. And yet, so many of us get trapped in this cycle. We don't want to disappoint anyone, so we keep saying yes. We don't want to be perceived as selfish, so we keep giving. We don't want to lose love, so we keep sacrificing. But the cost of this endless kindness is enormous. Slowly, you begin to lose sight of yourself. You don't even know what you want anymore, because your entire identity has been built around serving others. You become a stranger in your own skin. And here's where the monster within comes in, because when you suppress your needs, when you deny your anger, when you bury your boundaries in the name of kindness, those emotions don't disappear. They collect in the shadows, they ferment, and eventually they come out in ways you can't control. Maybe it's snapping at someone you love for something small. Maybe it's passive-aggressive comments, resentment that leaks out in subtle ways. Or maybe it's even darker, years of repressed feelings exploding all at once, leaving you shocked at the person you've become. We like to imagine that kindness protects us from darkness, but in reality, kindness without honesty creates the perfect breeding ground for it. Because every time you say yes when you mean no, every time you smile when you want to cry, every time you hold back your truth to make someone else comfortable, you are not being kind. You are abandoning yourself, and abandonment always has consequences. Now let's be real. Why do we do this? Why do kind people struggle so much with boundaries? The answer lies in our culture. From a young age, many of us are conditioned to believe that kindness equals worthiness, that being agreeable is safer than being authentic, that love is earned by what we give, not by who we are. Children who grow up in environments where love is conditional, where affection depends on performance, obedience, or self-sacrifice, often carry this belief into adulthood. They become adults who confuse people-pleasing with kindness. But true kindness does not erase the self. True kindness includes the self. If your kindness is costing you your mental health, your joy, your energy, then it's not kindness anymore. It's self-neglect dressed as virtue. And this is where the education comes in. Neuroscience tells us that the brain has something called the mirror neuron system. It's what allows us to feel empathy. When you see someone in pain, your brain lights up as if you are in pain too. That's why kindness feels so natural to us as humans. We are wired to connect. But here's the catch. Mirror neurons don't distinguish between healthy empathy and destructive empathy. If you constantly expose yourself to others' suffering without any boundaries, your brain essentially floods itself with stress signals. Over time, this leads to chronic stress responses, immune system issues, and emotional exhaustion. In other words, your brain is not built for endless, boundaryless kindness. It's built for balanced connection. So, the dark side of kindness is not that kindness itself is bad. It's that kindness can be twisted by fear, by conditioning, by culture, by our own unhealed wounds, into something that looks noble on the surface but slowly eats us alive inside. And when that happens, the very thing we thought was our greatest strength becomes the very thing that breaks us. Now let's pause and reflect here. If you've ever felt this, the exhaustion, the resentment, the sense of being invisible even though everyone calls you so kind, you're not alone. You're not broken. You're not defective. What you're experiencing is the natural consequence of a world that doesn't teach us how to balance giving with protecting ourselves. It's the monster within, not because you're bad, but because unexpressed truths eventually demand to be seen. And this brings us to the real question. How do we embrace kindness without letting it destroy us? How do we stay compassionate without turning into martyrs? How do we love others without abandoning ourselves? So, how do we do it? How do we embrace kindness in a way that heals instead of harms? The answer lies in one simple but deeply uncomfortable truth. Kindness must begin with you. Not in a selfish disregard for others kind of way, but in the sense that if your kindness doesn't include yourself, then it isn't truly kindness at all. It's performance. And performance eventually collapses. Think of it like this. If you've ever flown on an airplane, you know the safety instructions. In an emergency, put your oxygen mask on first, before assisting others. At first glance, that advice feels almost wrong, almost unnatural. Why would I not help my child or my loved one first? but the logic is undeniable. If you pass out from lack of oxygen, you can't help anyone. The same principle applies to kindness. If you neglect your own needs, your own rest, your own well-being, your ability to truly care for others eventually suffocates. This is where boundaries enter the picture, and boundaries for many kind people feel terrifying. Boundaries feel like rejection. They feel like selfishness. They feel like shutting people out. But in reality, boundaries are the purest form of honesty. A boundary says, this is what I can give, and this is what I cannot. It says, my love is real, but it cannot exist if I'm empty. It says, I care enough to show you my limits, because without them, my care will rot into resentment. Psychologists describe boundaries as the invisible lines that define where you end and where another person begins. Without those lines, relationships blur into dependency, manipulation, or silent suffering. With them, relationships become clear, mutual, and grounded in respect. In fact, research shows that people who set healthy boundaries often experience deeper, more meaningful relationships, because their kindness comes from choice, not compulsion. And here's another fact. People who respect their own boundaries are actually seen as more trustworthy. Why? Because when they say yes, you know they mean it. Their kindness isn't forced, it's authentic, and authenticity is magnetic. But here's the challenge. Setting boundaries isn't just about saying no to others, it's about saying yes to yourself. And that can feel uncomfortable if you've spent your whole life equating worth with selflessness. It can feel like you're betraying the very identity that people admire you for. You might even lose relationships in the process. Some people won't like it when you stop overextending yourself. Some will push back, accuse you of changing, maybe even withdraw from you. And that's painful, but it's also necessary. Because relationships built on the expectation of endless giving were never truly balanced in the first place. Now let's dig a little deeper into the psychology. There's a concept known as pathological altruism. It describes what happens when the desire to help actually causes harm, either to the giver or the receiver. For example, when someone sacrifices their health to care for others, or when constant rescuing prevents the other person from ever learning independence. Pathological altruism looks like kindness, but it creates dependency, guilt, and exhaustion. It is, quite literally, kindness gone wrong. This ties into something even bigger. The cultural myth of the good person. Many societies idealize kindness as the highest virtue, but often in a way that subtly encourages self-erasure. Think about how often we hear phrases like, she's such a good girl, she never causes trouble, or he's such a nice guy, he always helps everyone. Hidden in those compliments is a dangerous assumption that goodness means never making demands, never saying no, never disrupting the peace. But real goodness is not about erasing yourself. It's about showing up as your full, authentic self and still choosing compassion. When kindness comes from authenticity, it liberates. When it comes from fear, it enslaves. So what can you do practically to shift from enslaved kindness to liberated kindness? Here are some strategies, not as quick fixes, but as lifelong practices. First, practice the pause. When someone asks something of you, don't immediately say yes. Take a breath. Give yourself space to check in with your own needs. Ask, do I have the energy for this? Do I want to do this? Is this request aligned with my values? Even a few seconds of reflection can save you from automatic people-pleasing. Second, learn the power of gentle no's. A no doesn't have to be harsh. It can be compassionate and kind. I care about you, but I can't take this on right now. Or, I'd love to help, but I don't have the capacity. The world won't fall apart if you say no. In fact, the more honest you are, the more people will respect your yes. Third, reframe your worth. Your value is not determined by how much you give away. Your value is intrinsic. You existed before anyone needed you, before you learned to perform kindness to survive. You are worthy of love, even when you say no, even when you rest, even when you take nothing on your shoulders. Fourth, tend to your own garden. Fill yourself with the things that nourish you, friendships that feed your soul, creative pursuits, moments of stillness. When you live from abundance rather than scarcity, kindness flows naturally. It's not forced, it's not depleting. It becomes a gift rather than a transaction. And fifth, Allow yourself to feel the harder emotions: anger, frustration, sadness. These are not enemies of kindness. They are signals. They tell you when your boundaries are being crossed, when your needs are being ignored. If you suppress them, they morph into the monster within. But if you acknowledge them, if you listen, they become guides that point you toward balance. Let's return to the metaphor of masks. For many people, kindness has become a lifelong mask. The smile you wear to cover the exhaustion, the yes you give to avoid conflict, the generosity you perform to prove your worth. But masks are heavy, and the longer you wear them, the harder it becomes to remember what your own face looks like. The real journey is not to throw away kindness, but to remove the mask and let kindness come from the real you. The you that can say yes and no with equal honesty. The you that is kind without disappearing. There is an old saying, if you want to know who you truly are, look at how you treat yourself when no one is watching. That's where authentic kindness begins. Not in the approval of others, not in the praise of being the nice one, but in the quiet choices you make for your own well-being. Do you rest when you're tired? Do you forgive yourself when you fail? Do you speak to yourself with compassion? If not, then your kindness to others is built on a fragile foundation. The irony is this: when you treat yourself with true kindness, your kindness toward others becomes more powerful, not less. Because it comes from overflow, not depletion. It inspires rather than exhausts. It invites others to rise with you instead of lean on you endlessly. And maybe that's the final lesson here. The dark side of kindness isn't about rejecting kindness. It's about transforming it. From a mask into a mirror. From compulsion into choice. From survival into love. So the next time someone tells you that you're so kind, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, is this kindness coming from fear or from freedom? From exhaustion or from abundance? From the mask or from the real me? The answer to that question will tell you more about yourself than any compliment ever could. Because at the end of the day, the monster within kind people is not their anger, not their limits, not their boundaries. The real monster is self-neglect. And once you face it, once you set down the mask, you'll discover that your kindness doesn't disappear. It only grows stronger, sharper, more radiant. It becomes the kind of kindness that doesn't just keep others alive, but keeps you alive too. And maybe that's the ultimate kindness. To live fully as yourself, without erasing, without performing, without apologizing. To show the world that compassion doesn't mean self-erasure, it means truth. That's the kind of kindness the world needs most. Not endless yeses, not silent suffering, but the courage to love without losing yourself. It starts quietly. No one notices at first. You're 7 years old, staring into the eyes of a parent who is falling apart. Maybe it's addiction. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's just the hollow silence of someone too broken to show up. And without words, something ancient clicks in your small mind. If I don't hold everything together, no one will. This is how a child disappears. Not physically, but psychologically. They smile more. They cry less. They learn to read the room before they speak. They become the emotional thermostat of the household. They become small adults long before their minds are ready, and the world praises them for it. You're so mature. You're so responsible. You're so strong. But no one ever stops to ask, at what cost? This is the invisible grief of those who grew up too fast. And today we're going deep inside the psychology of that child. Because the effects don't vanish with age. They shape you. They follow you into relationships, careers, your sense of worth. And if you don't understand what happened, you'll spend your adult life repeating the survival patterns that once saved you, but are now slowly killing you. Let's start with what's really happening developmentally. When children are forced to emotionally support adults instead of the other way around, psychologists call this parentification. It's when a child becomes the caregiver, the peacekeeper, the therapist, the protector. This isn't just unhealthy, it rewires the brain, because when a child is consistently put in charge of emotional regulation, either their own or others, it creates something called hypervigilance. You're always scanning for danger. You walk on eggshells. You learn that love is a transaction. You give peace, and maybe they'll give you safety. You learn that your needs are dangerous and theirs are urgent, so you disappear, not physically, but emotionally, and in your place grows a version of you that performs well. You become the good child, the quiet achiever, the therapist friend, the one who never asks for anything, and you wear that identity so convincingly that even you forget it's a mask. But deep down, something hurts, something aches, because the inner child you buried didn't die. They're still in there screaming silently, "Why didn't anyone protect me?" As you grow older, the symptoms become more complex. You might become hyper-independent. You refuse help, push people away, or never feel truly safe in love. You might feel numb during happy moments, because joy feels unfamiliar, unearned, even dangerous. You might struggle to rest because productivity is the only way you've ever felt worthy. And worst of all, you might not even realize you're still stuck in survival mode. Because when dysfunction is normalized early, your nervous system accepts chaos as baseline. Stillness feels wrong. Peace feels suspicious. Love feels like a debt you'll have to repay. This is the psychology of a child forced to grow up too fast. It's not just sadness. It's a complex trauma that reshapes how you view the world, and more importantly, yourself. Now, you may ask, why would any child willingly take on that role? Because children will do anything for attachment, even abandon themselves. The choice is never conscious, it's biological. In the absence of safety, the child sacrifices authenticity for belonging. That's not weakness, that's intelligence, that's instinct. But the tragedy is this: what saved you then imprisons you now. So many of us are walking around as high-functioning adults, with deeply neglected inner children pulling the strings. We overachieve to earn love. We stay silent to avoid abandonment. We take care of everyone, but secretly wish someone would just ask if we're okay. And that fantasy, that someone will notice you're not as strong as you pretend to be, that maybe, just maybe, you'll finally get to fall apart and be held. That is the unmet need, not of your adult self, but of the child who never got to be a child. The first step to healing isn't fixing, it's witnessing. Because until you validate what happened, you'll keep gaslighting yourself with thoughts like, "It wasn't that bad. Other people had it worse. I turned out fine." But fine is a mask too, and deep down you know it. So what happens to that child? When they grow up, they become adults who never feel safe, even in calm rooms. They become lovers who can't trust softness. They become givers who can't receive. They become the kind of people who apologize for crying, flinch at compliments, and confuse exhaustion with success. This is the cost of growing up too fast. Because if your childhood trained you to be strong at the expense of being soft, to be quiet instead of honest, to fix others while ignoring your own fractures, then what kind of adulthood do you inherit? You inherit a life where you're always holding your breath, waiting for someone to give you permission to finally fall apart. But here's the truth. No one's coming to rescue the child you buried. You are the one who must go back and hold their hand. You are the one who must say what no one else ever said. You didn't deserve that. You were just a child. You get to rest now. This is the beginning of shadow work. Not fixing, not performing, not bypassing the pain with fake positivity, but turning toward the abandoned parts of yourself and saying, "I see you now, I hear you now, and I'm not leaving." That is the reparenting process, and it's brutal because it asks you to feel the grief you never had time to feel. It asks you to sit with the rage, the sorrow, the unmet needs, to weep for the birthdays where no one showed up, to mourn the innocence you lost while protecting people who should have protected you. But that grief, it's not weakness, it's proof that you're healing, because what was once frozen is finally thawing. Now let's talk about how this survival pattern shows up in adulthood, subtly, tragically, and often invisibly. You might become a therapist in all your friendships, but never let anyone truly see you. You might be praised for your independence, when deep down you're terrified of being a burden. You might be in relationships where you overfunction, always fixing, managing, over-explaining, and wondering why you feel resentful. You might struggle with boundaries because saying no still feels like betrayal. These are not personality traits. They are coping strategies, learned, conditioned, and, the good news, unlearnable. But only when you stop idolizing your strength and start honoring your wounds. One of the most powerful things you can do is ask your inner child, what did I need back then that I never got? You may hear answers like, I needed someone to tell me it wasn't my fault. I needed someone to ask how I was doing. I needed to play, rest, laugh, without fear. And slowly, very slowly, you begin to give those things to yourself. Not to fix your past, but to stop reliving it. This is how you stop seeking parents in your partners. This is how you stop mistaking anxiety for intuition. This is how you stop running from the child you were and the self you're becoming. Carl Jung once said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But shadow work demands that we face it, all of it, the neglected, the ashamed, the scared, the angry, because healing isn't about becoming someone new, it's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. So if you're someone who grew up too fast, know this, your maturity was never the problem. The problem was that you had no choice, but now you do. You can choose softness, you can choose to rest, you can choose to stop managing everyone else's emotions and start honoring your own. And no, it won't happen overnight. There will be days you feel like a child again. Good, that's the point. Let that child come home. Let them cry, let them play, let them finally be seen. Because you're not broken, you're becoming whole. And maybe for the first time, you're finally growing up the right way. Not through pressure, not through fear, but through truth. You never had a childhood, but you still have a future. And this time, you get to write it.